Thanks everyone for joining us for the second episode of Waste Free Wednesdays. We did a general waste in Worcestershire that was presented by Emma last week, which is very good. And we had lots of sort of comments and questions from that event. And today we're going to do a little bit on composting, focusing on mainly cool composting, but we do have places you can go to for more information about other types of composting, and I can signpost you to those after I've done the little talk. So I'm going to start off with just a quick quiz. What do you think the approximate percentage of households that compost in the UK are? Those of you who've trained by me might remember this one. Do you think it's 10%, 20%, 30%, or 40%? The answer is 40%. It varies a little bit depending on where you live. And I was trying to find some evidence. I've been trying to find evidence of this for ages, and I eventually found a RAP report where they did quite a large survey. I mean, you can't say it's indicative of the entire country, but I think they did their best to. Now, let me decipher this for you slightly. So it's been broken down into rural, prosperous, mature, urban, and mining/industrial, which is an interesting one. I hadn't thought of that before. And then what we're looking at here is the green columns, basically those that have said that they home compost. And so rural is a clear sort of 40%, prosperous, even I think that's slightly higher. Then it's also reasonably high, about 40-ish for mature. And then it just drops a tiny bit on urban, but then drops a little bit more for mining industrial, which I thought was interesting. Which of these processes most accurately describe composting? Fermentation, aerobic decomposition, respiration, or hydration? Turned into a bit of a science lesson now. Correct answer, aerobic decomposition. Decomposition as in breaking things down, rotting down, but the aerobic is because it needs air for that process to work. Now, interestingly, the one next to that, fermentation, there are some sort of different types of composting systems like bokashi, for example, which actually is fermentation, but traditionally speaking, a normal composting, that's the what kind of worms will you find in a compost bin? And don't say wriggly ones. Do you think it's slow worms, earthworms, brandling worms, or inchworms?
C.
B.
Oh, shouting out now. The kind of worms we need are actually brandling worms. An earthworm will not actually do the job of composting at all. They're much more different. They're deep burrowers, the earthworms. They're the ones that make sort of like soil very good condition. Composting only works if you turn it regularly. I've put that one in there just because it's one of those classic myths, isn't it, that you have to turn your compost. And yes, it's true. If you look after your compost and you turn it regularly, well, of course it will break down quicker because you're getting more air into the process. But we certainly the Garden Organic, who's the charity that I sort of work for, over the years they've tried to simplify the message and sort of get that message out that actually you don't need to do that turning, because it's not easy for everyone to go and turn compost because it's quite heavy material to keep turning, isn't it? So you don't need to do that, and I'll talk you through how you can get good compost without turning as well as we go through the session. On which surface will composting work best? On decking, on slabs, on tarmac, or on bare earth?
Bare earth, ideally, I'd say.
Bare earth.
But it will work on all of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. Bare earth is best, but it will work. Totally true. As long as those creatures can get to it, and it's amazing how they do find their way there, even if it's sitting flat on sort of tarmac and you've got no soil anywhere near, they find their way there. It just will take longer, though, that's the only thing. Composting is only for people who have an allotment or grow their own vegetables. Is that true or false? That's a bit
False.
You all know the answer to that one, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course not. But it is actually a conception that's out there. A lot of people will say, I mean, really, you can make compost and actually just put the mixture in your borders as a weed suppressant, as a mulch. You could actually scatter it over your lawn as a fertilizer. So you can make compost and still use that in your garden. It's trickier if you don't have a garden at all, but even in those situations, you could be growing have a few little pots on your windowsill if you were in a flat or something, and use the material in that. We shouldn't compost because the process emits carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Is that true or false?
It's false.
Yeah, false. Yep. You could
I'm
argue.
not sure that it emits those things.
Well, yes, it does emit all those things, so there is truth in it. The bit, I suppose the bit we're contesting is the we shouldn't compost because bit. So it depends on how much it releases, and this is where gets quite complicated, and people do disagree on this. From what I can tell from quite trustworthy studies, is that yes, composting emits carbon dioxide. I think I put something on the slide here just to remind me of it. But only the carbon dioxide that it absorbed in its lifetime. So when it was growing, that fruit and those vegetables absorbed carbon dioxide, and it releases it as it decomposes, but it doesn't release all of it. Some of it gets into the soil. And then what's extra interesting, which I'll come to later on, is the benefits of carbon capture when you then use the compost in the soil. But I'll save that one because I've got some slides on that later. So yes, people disagree on this item, and the levels of methane and nitrous oxide, I've seen some studies that say they're very, very low, and technically it does offset those emissions by having a compost bin rather than putting that material into a landfill or incineration facility. But how you work that stuff out is quite tricky to say for definite, isn't it? Sorry, so a slightly more complicated question there, but I thought it was an interesting one to raise. So what is compost? So we talked already a little bit about how it's when things break down, but what things are they? So it's organic matter that we're talking about: fruit, vegetables, grass, leaves, twigs, and even cardboard to a point as well. We can add that in. And we need that air. We need the aerobic decomposition to be a part of it. Now, if I go into a school and talk about this, I might talk about, well, actually, isn't compost soil, or dirt? Isn't it the same thing? A child might certainly say that. And the difference really is that compost is kind of full of life, really. And soil has more rock and sand and silt and clay, and it has much less sort of life in it. And our soil has degraded over the years as well due to industrial agriculture and what we do to our gardens, even in the case of home composting. So there is a lot of difference between soil and compost. But we can improve soil by adding compost, and that's a fundamental thing. And studies all agree you can improve. Different studies will say on the amount you can improve it and how deep those improvements go. And I'll come back to that when we talk about carbon storage a little bit later on, which is quite interesting. Just that tiny little teaspoon of compost will contain millions of microscopic creatures, tiny things that you would need a very good microscope to see, full of life. And there's lots of reasons why we should compost. I'm going to briefly go over these. I would normally spend a little bit longer, but I don't think we'll have enough time to do it in detail. But let's start with the obvious things, like about how it helps your garden grow. It does amazing things for soil. I said about adding life to it. So lightens up and breaks up heavy soils and then bulks up light sandy soils as well. So it's a great leveler in terms of balancing your soil out. And it feeds everything within it, all those little organisms. So you really, if you've been applying compost to your garden for many, many years, the differences between testing yours and some barren piece of land elsewhere, the differences are incredible. It saves money from buying a lot of products. If you walk into any garden centre, there are just rows and rows of chemical products that an organic gardener would actually say we do not need at all. Compost will improve your soil. It will fertilise. As a mulch, you can use it as a weed suppressant, so therefore you don't need to be spraying things all the time. You can work with nature rather than fighting against it. It also reduces pollution, and it depends how far you want to go with this. On a basic level, you wouldn't need to burn things in your garden, which is a good thing because that affects air pollution. It means you're not buying as much stuff, which of course has embodied carbon and embodied pollution in the making of things and in factories. And you could argue there's the reduction of waste side of it, which is obviously what Let's Waste Less is all about, is that by not sending all of that material that's been picked up by trucks, and you haven't got large facilities that are processing that material, that you're reducing emissions all the way along the chain. You're just using it yourself. And if you, in the landfill scenario, which isn't true in Worcestershire because there's only a very small, partly true in Worcestershire, there's a small amount that goes to landfill in Worcestershire, but a lot of it goes to EnviroRecover, to where they burn to create electricity. But in a landfill, it would give off methane, where the incinerator does actually reduce emissions. That's not true in that case, but it's still worth pointing it out because a lot of people still do landfill. We're a lot better in this country for it, but other countries still landfill quite a lot, to be honest. But methane is a big problem. I'm sure you know, it's a lot more powerful than CO2, and it also traps CO2 in the atmosphere. So methane's almost a bigger one to tackle in terms of climate crisis than CO2 in the short term, because it can make a big difference. I've just mentioned energy recovery there, the process of turning it into electricity, which is a slightly different method. But we like to think it's a closed loop cycle. So if you know the circular economy, that idea of nothing being wasted, this is certainly true of your compost bin in your garden, or your compost heap even, because you take your waste and you're processing it yourself, but then you're using the product. And at no point have you had to drive anywhere to go and collect that. So that's a benefit in that sense as well. So it's a very simple, natural, organic process and a method of waste reduction. And it's better than recycling. As I've said already, it doesn't need trucks, doesn't need energy, doesn't need all that extra stuff that has to go into normally getting rid of our waste. And it also stops us from using peat compost. And sometimes you might not realise that you're using peat compost when you buy compost from a garden centre. Things are slightly improving, but Garden Organic have been campaigning for many, many years about stopping peat compost. And that campaign has been, it's struggled to get the government, DEFRA and the people in charge to make changes about banning peat compost. It's still perfectly legal to sell peat compost. Some people are trying to sort of, in this more environmentally aware world that we're in, by selling sustainable peat compost. And the argument there would be, well, there's no such thing as sustainable peat compost. It's not like planting a bamboo plantation and it grows really, really quickly. You can't do that with peat. And we have to protect these environments for purposes of wildlife as well, because they're very rare habitats for certain types of butterflies and moths and all sorts of things. When we talk about farming, obviously I mentioned before about how industrial agriculture has ruined soil over the decades of how we've been producing our food, and we grow 95% of our food in the soil. So that really is a big issue. We're more aware of sort of like ocean pollution and those things at the moment, but actually soil is really a ticking time bomb of issues. The Drawdown report recently said that actually composting could offset most of our emissions if we start putting organic matter back onto farmers' fields and so forth around the world. We only have to put a small amount back onto the soil to actually offset the emissions that we're constantly looking, oh, how do we do this, how do we do that? And yet we've got the waste, we've got the rubbish, we've got the organic matter. It's quite easy to add it to some farmers' fields. Composting releases CO2, we've already mentioned that, but only what was already held in there. It also improves the soil's ability to store carbon. And quite recently, there were some studies done, I think in California, I forget now, where they started to test deeper down in the soil to see the difference it makes. And they found that comparing it with crops and then crops and compost, that the soil was able to hold carbon to quite a higher level. I forget what the percentages are, sorry. But it was quite surprising how deep down the effects were. Now, I'm going to go through some quick tips on getting the composting right. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the call, but I'll repeat because obviously a couple of people joined us. We're talking about cool composting here, so not hot composting, which will get a result much, much quicker. And there are certain things you can put into a hot composter, which we don't recommend in cool composting. And I'll come to the reasons for that later on as well. So we're going to look at position, heat, air, food and water, the 5 basic sort of building blocks of getting your composting right. So food, first of all, recommend that 50-50 approach of greens and browns. The greens being high in nitrogen and moisture and they rot down very quickly, and the browns which are high in carbon and they take a lot longer to compost, and different types of browns will take a lot longer. When we talk to people on the Let's Waste Less stands, when we go out to events and they say, well, I tried composting, but it went really smelly and slimy. What was I doing wrong? And that's probably one of the most common things that we hear. And it is just adding too much greens and not balancing it with browns. That's quite common really, because it depends on the size of your garden. The grass cuttings are going in, the fruit and veg waste is going in, and other types of food items as well, building up, and there is no balance there at all. So yes, that does cause a problem. When we talk about greens, we're talking about things like obviously grass, veg and fruit waste, but also things like even hay, prunings, a bit of light debris, nothing too not thick branches there because they take ages to break down. Nettles will be fine, and annual weeds. Obviously, perennial weeds where they keep coming back all the time, you'd be more cautious of, because you don't want those sort of growing in there. But a hot composter, which I said I wouldn't talk about, and I just am, would deal with pretty much anything. To be honest, they can devour things very, very quickly. And even coffee grounds was the one I missed out there as well. A great compost ingredient. And then browns. This is the stuff that gets missed out. And it can be a struggle to find enough browns to balance. So this is where you have to be a little bit more creative with it. So we've all got probably bits of junk mail, cardboard, newspaper. You can certainly add some of that. There are some arguments to say it's better to recycle it than add it to your compost. It's close, I think, really. Possibly just slightly better on the recycling, but then you need to keep your compost going as well. So it's certainly not a bad thing to do, let's put it that way. But there are some things that you wouldn't put into your recycling bin. For example, shredded paper can cause problems in the recycling process. Just to be really clear though, you can put it into your recycling bin if you put it into something like an envelope. It needs to be going through the process flat, so it goes up the conveyor belt. In loose bits, it's just going to fall through the process. But also kitchen paper is quite a good one as well. And even things like tissues, as long as you haven't got like sort of blood or meat juices on them, which would attract rats, that would be okay as a compost ingredient. Although with kitchen roll, be careful it's not like a plenty one, which is like made of plastic, those super strong ones, the ones you can wring out. There's only one reason you can wring them out, and that's because they're made with plastic. Which ones haven't I mentioned? Egg boxes are quite a good one because they're quite a chunky item. So if you put the egg box in either whole or maybe just in the two halves, it creates a nice pockets of air around it. Woody prunings, as I mentioned, not too thick, or you could chop them up, shred them down, and autumn leaves as well. Although if you've got too many leaves, like if you've got many trees surround your garden, you might want to make leaf mold instead. And even hair as well, human hair, even dog hair. If you cut your own dog's hair at home, for example, would all be fine. It's a very good Brown's ingredient. Sawdust, just make sure it's an untreated wood. That's the only thing I'd say from an organic perspective. Sometimes wood does get treated with things you don't want to be going back into the soil. And then there are some materials that are a mixture of browns and greens, just naturally. They just have both elements there. So obviously with things like hedge clippings, you've got little bits of twigs and stuff in there, but then you've got the green leaves as well. Bedding plants, similar. Pet bedding is quite, if you had a gerbil, a rabbit, a vegetarian eating pet, basically, both the poo, very high in nitrogen, and the bedding, the carbon of the sawdust or whatever material it is in there, it's a good balance of materials if you happen to have one of those pets. Tea leaves and bags, but just be careful. We try to, these days, recommend to make sure it's not one with plastic in. I know it's a very small amount of plastic, and some gardeners will say it's an insignificant amount. I think we're at that stage now that there's no such thing as an insignificant amount of plastic to be adding into soil. Animal manure mixed with straw or wood shavings will be fine. Tops off carrots, thorny prunings, cut flowers, not with wrapping on them, as that picture shows there. And also be careful what they treat cut flowers, spray them with all sorts of things. You can even have glitter and things on them as well, can't you? So be careful what's been added to the cut flowers is the only thing I'd say there. And then a couple of things that are neither a green or a brown. We have eggshells and wood ash, both of which are very good. Eggshells, you might want to crush them down a little bit because you'll probably find they won't break down at all, really. So when you do add material into your garden, you'll probably find little bits of eggshell, but no bad thing there at all. And then wood ash is fine, not coal ash, though. That's quite important. The impurities in coal, not recommended to be adding into the garden. So those. It is not a complete list, but it's just the main materials I've picked out of the list to add. And then things that you shouldn't add, just to be really clear if anybody wasn't too au fait with composting. Cool composting, obviously meat, fish, cooked food, bread, bones, pasta, liquids, dairy products. Now in a sealed hot composter, you could kind of put all of those in because the rat, they're I won't say rat proof, but they're much more rat proof than anything else. And it breaks down so quickly as well. It processes the material. And then thick woody material would have to be chopped up or shredded to break down quick enough. And then never animal feces as well. A lot of the changes in the Waste Regulations Act have tightened up on a lot of the things we put into compost and where we transfer waste to. And there are dangerous diseases that we don't want to be passing on to humans through that. So when you're handling that material, not a good thing to do. Heat and air. Now, the heat is a very important part, obviously, of the process. And if you plunged your hands into a compost heap or a compost bin, you will feel the heat in there. And when you add new material, it starts to heat up, it gets to work. All the little microorganisms get really, really busy. And if you're regularly adding material, it will keep regularly heating up and cooling down, heating up and cooling down. It's a constant process. And the more air you add to the process, the more it speeds up. And that comes back to the turning thing. You can do it if you want to, but if it was physically difficult or you just couldn't be bothered, you don't have to. You'll just have to wait a bit longer for your compost. That's the only thing I'd say. An easier method than turning it is the broom handle. Just plunging it down creates nice little channels of air all the way down. If you don't add any air at all, you're just layering with brown and green and maybe the occasional little broom handle method. You might have to wait about 12 to 18 months, but you could be as quick as 12 weeks if you really looked after it. And just remember that what happens in the summer is very different to what happens in the winter. A lot of those microorganisms and those creatures will go into a hibernation state to survive through the winter, which means the composting process will virtually completely stop. The only exception to that might be if you had a wormery and you kept it inside and a nice even temperature. A wormery can keep going all year round. The position of your bin, now we sort of already mentioned this a little bit, bare earth is best, but it will work in other places. If you had no choice, if you had a tiny garden and it had only been slabbed, it would be fine. Or you could maybe remove one of the slabs and just pop the Dalek bin or whatever type of bin on the bit of earth underneath it. Now the sun shade sort of issue, partial sun and shade is best for getting a good effect. If it was in full sun, it might get too hot and that can sort of like kill off the organisms and they won't work as well. But if you had no sun at all, which is probably the more common scenario, because we tend to shove our compost bins out of sight, sometimes behind the shed, under a fence, under a tree. And that means the process, a little bit like winter, will slow right down because they're just not getting any heat at all. It gets very cold in those shady spots. So that's the main things to watch out for with position. And then water. You shouldn't have to add water to a compost bin if you've got the greens and the browns right. There are exceptions to that. If we had a really hot summer, that's obviously going to get more and more likely, as we might have to start adding more water to it to raise the moisture content. But then the lid is a very important part of that process. It will keep, leaving the lid on in wet conditions keeps the rain out, so it stops it from getting too wet. But then in very dry conditions, it keeps the moisture in, so it keeps it sort of an even level of moisture sort of all year round. You can give it a quick squeeze if you're not sure. You should just be able to squeeze a tiny little bit of moisture off, at least feel it in your hand. It shouldn't feel dry or dripping wet either. Quite easy to test really how it's getting on. Now, I'm not going to go into details of compost bin. That's more sort of things we'd go through in a much longer session. But if you have got a question, I could direct you possibly to somewhere with a bit more information. But just to let you know, with the range of compost bins, in the top middle is the Dalek bin, which is the one that's subsidised by the county council. I have a slide later on that's got the prices on that. Top left is a can of worms. That's a wormery. Quite expensive. You're looking at probably at least £90 for something like that. You can make your own wormeries, and there are things online you could easily find on that. The top right one is a hot bin, which are very popular with people who have a lot of material to break down, like big gardens. Some people have 2 or 3 of these if they've got huge property to look after. The bottom left is kind of like an in-between cool hot composting. It's a green Joanna, gets up to higher temperatures. What they consider to be a rat-proof base at the bottom of that. Obviously, the rats can get into all sorts though, but it is very secure. The middle one is the bokashi. That's the fermentation process. Now, bokashi is quite an interesting one to pair up with something like a Dalek bin. Both quite inexpensive, only about £20 for a pair of bokashes. If you got them second hand, you could probably get them for £5 or £10, to be honest. And then the Dalek bin is relatively inexpensive as well. But what this means is the bokashi, you can put all of your food waste material like the meat and the fish and those things you normally wouldn't be able to add to a Dalek bin in your kitchen. And they will break it down in a fermentation process, and you add a little bit of bran to it, so you have to have the bran as well, but you don't use an awful lot, and you have to squash it down flat and drain off a little bit of liquid from the pot, and then you put it to one side, let it ferment for a couple of weeks, and then carry on filling the next one. And when it's done, you could add it into your composter to finish composting down, because it won't be anything like compost material. You won't have that crumbly brown mixture at all. It'll be fermented down, which is a very, very different thing. And then the bottom right one is not a composter at all. It's a waste digester. That one's called the green cone. You can see smaller versions of these, which sometimes they call them like pet waste digesters, and sometimes people buy them for just dealing with their dog and cat poo, for example. Different people report different levels of success with these, depending on your soil type. You've also got to be careful what you grow around it. You don't want to be growing any sort of root vegetables, anything that you're going to eat from that. So there are issues, and you have to move them as well. So not one for gardeners, possibly, but some young couples maybe that aren't particularly into gardening have chosen these, and some have had great success. So the Dalek bin, it is subsidised by Worcestershire County Council. If anyone has joined us from outside the council, you can all buy a Dalek compost bin from getcomposting.com. I think on the next page I've got a screenshot of getcomposting.com, and you just put your postcode in and it tells you what the offers are in your area, and they can deliver to your house. And at the bottom of the screen, I don't know if you can just see it, there's in the middle there's what they call the converter base plate, and it kind of makes it more like a green Joanna, really. It gives the Dalek bin a solid base. It's very, very thick, just to make it a bit more rat proof. Prevention is better than trying to sort of like get rid of the rats afterwards. Once they're in, aren't they, really? So prevention from the start is probably a better method of dealing with that. The subsidised compost bin offer. So at the moment it's £13.50 for a 220 litre and £16.50 for a 330 litre. And there are also offers where I think you get the second one half price, I think it is. I think that Emma can possibly confirm if she's still around.
I'm still around, and yes, you buy one, get one half price.
Thank you very much, said the voice from beyond. I've already mentioned rats, so I won't spend too long on it, but it is one of the reasons why people give up composting, sadly. If you've got rats nearby, and let's face it, we've all got rats nearby, they're never far away from us. There's a potential that they might find your compost bin for a nesting site. It's probably warm, so therefore, if you make it less cozy and warm, a little bit more of greens in there, a little bit moister than you would normally keep it, that will deter them. Changing the environment around the bin puts them off. They like to stick to their little rat runs around the outside. So if your bin is a bit more central, if they have to cross open ground to get to it, it will put them off a little bit. I've mentioned that. You could line your bin in a DIY method with builder's mesh. That's the sort of stuff that you use to strengthen concrete. It's not chicken wire. Chicken wire's got slightly larger holes, and it's not as tough as this stuff. The example I've just done down there is that someone's used cable ties, I think, to tie it around. You could also do it inside the bin rather than outside the bin, as long as it's really securely tied on. Tiny little bit on compostable packaging. We try to include this in all of our sort of online sessions when we do composting, because it's getting, and it's going to get more so, more complicated. Compostable packaging is being moved to very quickly. If you get magazines, you'll probably have noticed your daily newspaper with the little magazine in it, if they have those. Garden Organic magazine, for example, has done the same. We've all moved to sort of like potato starch, corn starchy covers, and they will break down most of the time relatively quickly in a home compost bin. There are other types of material which aren't as forgiving, to be honest. If you see that large logo there on the left, the seedling logo, that really has only been tested for industrial facility composting. That's getting up to much higher temperatures. We're talking about vegware. That's on all the vegware items. Now, if you look on VegWare's frequently asked questions, they will say themselves that they put it in their home compost bin and it does break down eventually, but it will take something like at least 18 months to break down. A hot composter might break it down a lot quicker. So if you've got loads of it, you really can't, if you've got one compost bin, it's just going to swamp it and become really dry material. Now, the label at the bottom is the only official OK Home Compost label. The TUV Austria is just the company that gives the certification for it. So it has to say home on it for it to be home compostable. You might see that label with industrial on it as well. We don't seem to use that as much in this country, but it is around. I have seen it on one or two things, but it's not very often. You might just say compostable, and this is where it's a huge grey area. They've probably tested it, and I'm sure it probably is fine. It's plant-based material, which is good. I mean, we're not using fossil fuels, but what they haven't done is they just haven't paid to get it properly certified, properly tested. So it's just something to watch out for. And I've just this screenshot of a flyer I did a while back just to remind myself of treat compostable materials as a brown. As I said, if you put loads of compostable items into your bin, it is just like putting loads and loads of newspaper in, or well, a little bit more than newspaper. It's something thicker than that. Loads of cardboard, I suppose, is the best way to compare it. So if you had loads of VegWare cups, if you'd had a kid's party and you'd bought VegWare cups and you just put them in one big stack, that will probably never break down, or it would take a very, very long time. You would have to put them in separately. And really the best thing to do would be to shred them or rip them up if you can be bothered to do that. But that would be the best way to get them to break down quickly. So just something to watch out for there. I mean, has anyone, have people seen more compostable labels popping up? Have you had any issues putting them in your compost bins?
I've been trying out some compostable plastics in my home, compostable plastics in my bin, but it's too early to say yet. I have a look in every now and again. I think, oh, they're still there. On a slight tangent, beware when I've got 9 compost bins because they're on a cycle, and I have to be careful about slow worms. Slow worms love compost bins, so please, if you see slow worms, they're a protected species. Don't upset them.
Thank you.
Something that I was asked by a member of the public when we did an event at Morven a few months ago. Yes. She said, oh, I don't put orange peel in my compost bin because it makes it acid. I'd never heard that before. And I think compost it. Is it?
Yeah, I think where they might, there's some truth in actually too much citrus peel does actually ruin the balance of it. We found this in school compost bins when we supported a school. Have break time and they all put their orange peel in stuff. It absolutely ruins it. It's just too much. Where they also might have heard about citrus peel that might have made them think, oh, don't put it in there, is when we talk about wormeries. Now it's fine in a normal bin in a small amount, but actually worms really don't like it. It is too acidic for them in the same way that onion skins are.
You mentioned onions there a lot. When I advertised this on the allotment site, a few people questioned onions and garlic. I tend to put everything in, but what's your view?
I think onions is fine. Once again, I think if you'd treat it like a citrus item in that you wouldn't want too much. I mean, I might call on the advice possibly of somebody like Nina maybe on that one. So,
with onions, I'd say it's like citrus peel. Try not to put too much in all at once. And be careful if you've got something like signs of white rot. White rot in onions will stay in the ground for about 12 years. So if you think the onions have got any kind of disease, don't compost them just in case.
Could I ask about adding when my horses have molted their hair? Is that all right?
Ooh.
Not the tail, but actually their coat, because as they've molted, because it's a little bit like pet hair, and I did think actually that would. I have put it in because I've got a green Johanna. And I've got an aero bin I'm waiting for, so I've got 2. Would that be okay to add in?
I don't think it'd be a problem. I can't think why it would be, because hair is fine, and there's nothing particularly about horsehair I would have thought would be an issue in terms of ticks or.
No, they don't carry anything like that. Like, we haven't got sheep, but I suppose with dogs, I mean, you think about it, if you had a very fluffy St. Bernard or a German Shepherd, that would be similar.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely fine. Of course,
and
you
the
have.
second thing is, talk to me about wormeries, because at the moment I've got a DIY one. I did actually see that a lot of councils, Emma, this is slightly your hat, do a sort of subsidised wormery. Worcestershire don't do that, or aren't going to make any plans for it. And also, what would you recommend? Because I've looked at the can of worms, but I've been told they're quite small. And I'm a bit like, well, you know.
Can of worms is probably the best one on the market at the moment. But actually, a DIY wormery, if you know what you're doing with it, and you've got the holes drilled in it right.
I have, yep.
You've got sort of like some sort of cover to keep the sun out if it's outside, or is it indoor you've got it? Or
I'm borrowing the caravan, which has been dumped on the lawn, so I've put them in the caravan. They're very happy.
They've got a caravan to themselves.
They're like camping.
No, that's holiday.
Quite. I don't think my father's too amused, but he's never used the caravan, so I thought, wow, keep them at an even temperature.
I love it.
Till they escape.
The worm caravan. I mean, that sounds perfect. They won't suffer the deeper temperatures in the winter, although a little bit of insulation might not hurt.
Yeah. I popped a horse rug over them when it was cold and frosty, and they seem quite happy with that.
Yeah, they should do. Sorry, what were you asking me now? Any other better one than the can of worm? Yes. So your DIY one, what did you use to make it?
I've used the 3 sort of one of those plastic stackable drawer things. Yeah. And I've drilled the holes in, and they have the top 2 as a suite, and then I've got my collection underneath.
Right.
And they seem quite happy.
Yeah. No, that's if they're happy, you know you're doing it right. That's the great thing about a wormery. It's not nice when you kill them off, and that's where you have to be careful with your temperatures and not putting stuff like grass cuttings in, because it just heats up so fast. But then, as long as you know what you're doing in terms of what you put in, it just goes and goes and goes, doesn't it? Yeah.
They seem quite happy, and they seem to be sort of eating and chomping. So. Yeah, they're a bit like pets, really.
They are absolutely, yeah. And they're a lovely one. I don't know if you have kids at home, but they're a great one to have to show children the process.
Yeah, I've got a 10-month-old who, if he took one look, he'd probably put it in his mouth at the moment. So yum. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Helen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, Helen, about why we don't subsidise them, we did when I first came to the council, so that was 4 years ago. But because they're so expensive and they're quite niche, people just even knock it, we'd have to significantly reduce the price to get them more popular. And we just don't have the budgets anymore. And, we're putting more and more into the composting, so, the actual Daleks and we have to. I mean, if it's any consolation, I mean, compost bin sales have gone through the roof the last couple of months. We've had about 57% in April and about 40% in May increase, because obviously with everything that's been going on and people not being able to access the HRCs and, me generally pushing composting at every opportunity, hopefully that's created this demand for it. So,
I was going to have a look on eBay and find someone who perhaps has got bored of it and pop myself a brand new one. I'm not being awful, but 90 quid for a nice little plastic box to put me worms in.
Or even on, do check the free sites first. You might be pleasantly surprised on FreeCycle and Freegal.
Fair enough. I'll have a look. Thank you.
Yeah, there's also Facebook Marketplace. I'm seeing a lot of people selling compost bins on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Right.
Well, we are digressing.
if anyone has a question about anything else waste related, I mean, we do have topics planned, haven't we, Emma? So I think next week, are we sticking with the idea we're going to do recycling and contamination as a tandem?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, we wanted to get that, you wanted to get that in, certainly, because at the moment, contamination levels are a huge issue for what's going through to Envirosort at the moment. It's quite depressing, really, isn't it, from your perspective, Emma, after you've worked so hard?
I'm waiting to hear the actual weights for residual waste, which is your black bin waste. But yeah, we have had issues around, things that wouldn't normally turn up, suddenly turning up in the recycling, which we're putting down to people not having capacity in their bins, not being bothered you know, I mean, we have the usual suspects, which are obviously your clothing and your nappies and your garden waste and your food waste and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, we've suddenly started seeing great big chunks of wood appearing. So
Can I just ask one? I think I started at the very beginning, but if some of the people have asked if they put their surplus green recycling stuff in a clear bag, does that get opened then? 'Cause I was stressing that they don't open the bags, you see, and it's like, oh, well, if I put it in a clear bag, will they open it?
If you put it in a clear bag or a box, if you've got too much, ideally a clear bag.
Or a cardboard box on the top.
Or a cardboard box, yeah. Because obviously I've had a lot of recycling extra because my daughter's back from uni, but I don't put all the mountains of wine and beer bottles in the clear bag. They go in the bin, and then I know when they're emptying my bin. Yeah, if you put it in a clear bag, the guys at Envirosort can actually see what's in the bag. Right. Because obviously if it's not, if they can't see it, they don't know if there's broken glass, needles, all sorts. Yeah. So this is what I say to people, you know, you lovingly put your recycling in a Tesco carrier bag, comes onto the production line when they first tip, and the first thing that happens is it goes straight down a chute back to EnviroCover. So, you know, someone spent time and energy recycling and it doesn't happen.
Can I ask about batteries? I've seen it. Is it in a little bag, like, you know, AA batteries? Would that be okay? Because I normally go to Lidl and do it, but I haven't. So
it depends where you live. If you live within Wychhaven,
yeah, in Ombersley.
You're Ombersley, so you're Wychhaven, are you? Yeah.
Yeah.
On your black bin day, you can put out electricals, textiles, and batteries in a little bag.
Yeah.
Put it on top of your bin, and there's a cage underneath the bin lorry. And what they do is they take it back to the depot and it gets sorted out into what it is, fab. And then passed on for reprocessing. It's just, they've got a separate contract with they've got an outside company that picks up their waste, so they can have those add-on services that the other 5 districts can't have.
Brill, thank you for that.
That's okay.
Can I just ask about aluminium foil?
Yes.
And the aluminium waste. If you can't put it in your green bin and you ended putting it in the residual waste, what happens when it meets the incinerator? The aluminium.
It just goes poof. Basically, it just melts. I mean, you can take your foil to the HRCs. We used to have foil bins, but I think that was collected by a charity which no longer collects them. But what I do, and what they say to me, is stick it in the scrap metal skip. It sounds a bit weird.
Redditch. Yeah, I did
but I'm there emptying my plastic bag of tin foil into the metal skip.
Yeah.
But yeah, then it just goes off with the rest of the metal for recycling.
Okay, thank you.
Well, on that happy note, I suppose we better call proceedings to a close. We went over for well over an hour there, and next week we're going to be probably covering similar ground actually. So have a little think about it. Speak to people that you know. If there's any questions that come up that you want Emma to answer, we'll do our best to try and find the best solutions for people. Thank you so much for a lot more people having than last week. And maybe that will continue.
And names that I don't recognise, but yeah, thank you everybody. Hopefully see you next week.
Take care all.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.